With roughly 40 games left to go in the season, who's lining up to make a run at the World Series? Has there been any progress made on the CBA? And we go around the diamond and on turning back the clock, a game that Greg Maddux wouldn't even believe. Today on the winning season with Seth G. I'm your host, Seth G, and we're going to jump right in today to divisional races in baseball. Couldn't believe yesterday, looking at the fact that there's only roughly 40 games left in the season. I feel like a lot of times baseball can get a little bit long in the summer. Seems like the season has just flown by. There's been so many great stories that there's just been so many things happening in the game, and we're getting right here down to the final stretch. So I thought it'd be a good time for us to take a look at the divisional races, the wild card races. And I think it's been about a month and a half ago on this show we made some predictions, and so we're going to check in a little bit on that. Take a look with 40 games left to see where we think everyone's going to line up for the playoffs, and kind of take a division by division look. So let's start out with the American League. So the American League's been such an interesting league this year because some people might want to use the word parity, others might use the word mediocrity. Just a lot of really average teams, a lot of teams floating around 500. There are a few exceptions to those, which we'll talk about, but generally speaking, the American League's still pretty wide open, just because from a wild card perspective, there's just so many teams that are still close, because so many teams have been hovering around the 500 mark for so much of the season this year. So, currently standing right now, start with the American League East. Tampa Bay is leading that division. They're the best team in baseball. They got off to kind of, I would say, a pretty average start, but man, they've been awfully good here throughout the last few months, and they continue to excel. And we'll talk more about them because I think there's an interesting piece when we get into the CBA with the Tampa Bay Rays. White Sox are leading the Central, really interesting division. And then, of course, the Astros in the American League West are currently winning that division, which honestly is it's really hard to get your head around that division, where it's at, and the challenges those teams have faced, because certainly it has not been a very good division this year. And you keep thinking a couple of these teams are going to take off, and that is not the case. Currently in the wild card right now, you've got the Yankees, Red Sox, and the Tigers and Rangers are currently tied for the third spot. So 3 teams from the American League East, a couple from the Central, and of course the Astros are by themselves in the West with really the struggles of that division as a whole. And then when we take a look at the National League, you got the Braves, Brewers, and Dodgers leading their division. Braves and Dodgers both have really large leads. The Brewers surprisingly don't have, I think, as big of a lead as teams think. And, the Cubs are right there, and we'll talk about them some more here in just a minute. Cubs, Padres, and Diamondbacks currently hold the 3 wild card spots. Kind of opposite of the American League, where you've got 3 teams between the Dodgers, Diamondbacks, and Padres from the West. You got a couple of teams from the Central, and the Cubs and the Brewers, and then the Braves. Out of the National League East, although I don't suspect it's going to stay that way as we play out the last 40 games. Now, before we get into predictions and who I think is going to win each division and who I think is going to come, out of the wild card, I do think it's such an interesting time in the season, because with 40 games left where we currently are, there are so many teams that are still involved, and there's so many teams that could still make it. Now, some of these teams need to get hot. Some of them need to have a really, really good last 40 games, 28-12 type stretches, and they could easily find themselves, in some cases, winning their division, but certainly getting into the wild card. So there's going to be a lot that's going to play out here over the next, call it month and a half. And I think even some of the races that today you look at and say, well, they're not really competitive. Again, there's still plenty of time. One team gets a little bit cold. One of these teams gets hot. And I think it's going to make for a pretty crazy end of the season, because, again, any team that goes on any type of good, strong run for a couple of weeks is going to find them in a totally different spot than they find themselves in today. And so let's get into each division and break it down. So let's start with the American League East. So the Rays are up 6.5 games. They got the best record in baseball. They came out of the All-Star break. They didn't play very well for a week or two, and then they've just been fantastic since. And they're really strong. At this point, it'd be hard to say that the Yankees are going to overtake the Rays. On paper, maybe you might think that. The Yankees obviously have really, really good pitching, but the Rays they're just good all around. They pitch well, they hit well. Not flashy as usual for them. They play good defense, and 6.5 game lead for that team. It would take quite the kind of collapse from them down the stretch, and it would also require the Yankees to certainly play better than they have been. So, not so sure that division is as competitive as 6.5 games might seem with 40 games to go. The American League Central, I think, is a really, really interesting division. So the White Sox still lead that division. Honestly, I struggle to just stand here today and say, "Yep, White Sox will make the playoffs." They've been poor for a long time. The season's been incredible. We've talked about them on previous episodes. But like somewhere in the back of your mind, it's still hard to think, like, are the White Sox really going to win that division? What's interesting is the Tigers, Twins, and Guardians are all within 5 games of the White Sox, and they all have losing records, by the way. So when you look at this, the Guardians are really playing poor right now. The Twins have been better. The Tigers keep hanging around. Obviously, they don't have Tarek Skubal anymore. But I just kind of wonder. I kind of keep thinking the Tigers are going to finally kind of get hot, maybe play a little bit more like the team they were last year, and maybe catch up to the White Sox. That one I think there's still a lot to be played in that division. Certainly the Guardians and Twins both have the capability of getting hot, and they could get themselves right back in. But it's a very interesting division because, again, you've got 4 teams, separated by 5 games. 3 of the 4 have losing records. And the White Sox continue to just kind of, plod along there and keep their record above 500, which for that division has been enough so far. But really interested to see the Tigers of the team. I think I've got my eye on because they're the one team I think that's got the talent. I love A.J. Hinch, regardless of him, again, being a former Astro that I struggle with a little bit. He's a great manager. I think he's proven that, in that situation in Detroit. And I just keep kind of thinking, are they going to put it together here down the stretch? So, and then that gets us to the American League West. God, I don't even know what to say about this division. So the Astros are up 3 games. Only team in the division above 500 by 3 games. They're up 3 on the Rangers and 6 on the Mariners. When you look at the Rangers team, again, I just really struggle to see them doing anything more than they've done all season down the stretch, which is probably play 500 ball, maybe a little below that. If the Astros play 500 ball, I think they win the division. And then the Mariners, this is a team that was so much fun to watch last year. The run in the playoffs was incredible. The fan base, Cal Raleigh's having this, kind of historic season. And I'll tell you, they've come out this year and they have been a bad baseball team. And I think the sample size is large enough now that I know I'm beginning to question, well, maybe last year was a fluke and this is who this team is. I don't know that that's obviously 100% true, but they have not, again, done anything this year that tells you that anything's going to change over the last 40 games. Now, they're a little bit like maybe the Tigers. They absolutely could finally put it together and go on a run. You look at that team on paper, you still kind of think, how are they not better than they are? And I think that's possible. But, Cal Raleigh is probably historically having a terrible year compared to the year he had last year. But there's still a lot of good pieces on that team. They've got good pitching. They have a really nice home field advantage when they play at home. And you just kind of keep thinking they're going to put it together. But they find themselves 6 games back right now. And they would have to have a heck of a stretch here at the end of the season to find themselves in contention for that division. But again, this division, it's not been good. It's not good. Somebody's going to get into the playoffs because they win that division, and you kind of scratch your head a little bit. Although I will say the Astros have been good the back half of the season. They've certainly played better. Yordan Alvarez is certainly one of the best players in all of baseball, and as I've mentioned before, a lot of fun to watch. But we'll see. But I can't see the Rangers making a run in their current roster makeup, and the Mariners just again on paper maybe, but I just struggle to see that right now. Let's move over to the National League, and let's start with the National League East. So the Braves are up 8.5 on the Phillies. The Braves get off to this incredible start. They build a huge lead. They play terrible for a month. The Phillies, I think, got within 2 games at one point. Phillies were on fire. Braves couldn't win a game. The Braves have played much better since then, especially since the All-Star break. The Phillies haven't been terrible by any means, but they certainly really cooled off. 8.5 games is a lot of games to make up. But I would say we've already seen that the Braves certainly can play really bad for weeks at a time, as they did earlier this year, and the Phillies can get really, really hot. So do I think that division's over with? Probably not. But again, it would take quite the collapse from the Braves, and the Phillies would have to get really hot. But again, we've seen that already once this year, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays off down the stretch. The National League Central, I think, is a division that most people are not paying much attention to, because you think, well, the Brewers are one of the best teams in baseball. They're going to easily win that division. They're running away with it, but that's not the case. The Cubs are still within 3 games. The Cubs have played really well. I think the Cubs are a legit contender. I think that they do a lot of things well, and I don't think that division's over with. And I think the Brewers, a lot like the Rays, nothing flashy on paper. You look at them and go, that's a solid team. They've had an incredible year. But I would just say, do not count the Cubs out. The Brewers don't have this huge lead. Matter of fact, they have the smallest lead in the National League. And I think the Cubs are 100% in contention to win that division, which we'll get to a little bit more in just a second. And then if we go out west, kind of interesting, the Dodgers are up 8 on the Padres and 9 on the Diamondbacks. Although, as we mentioned, the Padres and Diamondbacks are both currently in wild card spots. The Dodgers haven't played well since the trade deadline, which has been interesting because, again, when you look at their roster, you think, how does this team possibly go into a slump? I think part of it is offensively. They've got 3 or 4 really good pieces. Rest of that lineup's fairly mediocre. But I will say, as we go down the stretch here, they're going to get healthier, especially on the pitching front. And when you really think about the Dodgers and what makes them a dominant team, I think where most of us would have to say, if you're going to put money on somebody, you got to put on the Dodgers. Their pitching is exceptional, and as they obviously have gotten Snell back. If they get Glass now back, they've got Skubal. They got Yamamoto. I could just keep going on and on, right? I think that's where, in a short series, you really struggle to figure out how you're going to score against their top 2 or 3. And even in a 7-game series, again, really tough. Now, we saw last year in the World Series, they were taken to the very end and kind of an obscure home run that helped them win the World Series. But again, they've not played well, which I think has been a little bit surprising. I think after the trade deadline, with all the momentum, with Skubal, you kind of think, okay, this team's going to really take off, and that has certainly not been the case. So we'll see how they play down the stretch. Again, easily going to make the playoffs. I can't imagine any collapse. That team's too good to have any kind of major collapse for a long, extended amount of time. But kudos to the Padres and Diamondbacks in a division. I think from the beginning of the season, you knew those guys probably didn't have a chance, and I still don't think they do. They both played really well. Diamondbacks have really been good here recently, and those are 2 teams that would be very tough to play in the playoffs. And so, interesting to see how that shakes out. But again, it'd be hard to make any prediction other than the Dodgers in the West. So with that being said, let's talk about who I think is going to finish in the playoffs. And let's start with the American League. So I think Tampa is going to win the East. No surprise there. I do think the White Sox will hang on and win the Central. And also, I think the Astros will win the West, just because, as I mentioned earlier, I just can't see anybody else really doing anything in that division. The wild card's interesting. There's 6 teams within 3.5 games in the American League. And so I think it's a little bit of a tougher choice for sure. I think Yankees and Red Sox seem to be pretty much locked in. Again, there's enough time for anybody to move in or out, but I do think the Yankees and Red Sox are, definitely favorites, and I do think they'll both get in the wild card. But it actually leaves a kind of this group of teams for that last place. And for me right now, I'm going to pick the Detroit Tigers. They're the only other team besides the 5 I mentioned that have a positive run differential this year in the American League, which is crazy to think about in general. But I think the Tigers get it done down the stretch. I would just say I trust them a lot more than anybody else in that group of teams right now, although I wouldn't say I trust them a lot, but it's a little more than the other teams. And so I think at the end, just to recap, Tampa, the White Sox and Astros win the divisions. The Yankees, the Red Sox, and the Tigers are the wild card, which honestly would set up for probably a pretty incredible American League playoffs, because there's some really interesting teams in those six. Teams you'd expect to be there, teams you wouldn't expect to be there. And then what's interesting about this is, so last episode we talked a lot about the Dodgers. We're going to talk about the CBA here in a minute, and this idea that, hey, you got the 3 or 4 people at the top of the heap spending all the money. But here we are talking about the Tampa Rays, the Chicago White Sox, the Detroit Tigers. I mean, these are teams that you would not consider, and certainly wouldn't think about being big spenders or huge market teams. And although obviously the White Sox play in a huge market, but they've been bad for a really long time, not known to spend a lot of money. So again, you got small market teams that don't have those kind of payrolls getting into the playoffs, which kind of goes against the argument that, hey, you got to do something about teams like the Dodgers because nobody else has a chance. And I'll get to that a little bit more here in just a second. But let's jump over to the National League. So I think the Braves win the East. I think the Dodgers win the West. Those are pretty easy. I think if I have a bold prediction in this, I think the Cubs are going to win the Central. I don't know that I have a ton of facts to back that up, other than I like this Milwaukee team. They're a little bit like Tampa, though. These teams historically are really, really good in the regular season. They have really struggled in the playoffs. Unfortunately, when I look at both these teams this year, I think that might be the case again this year. Obviously, they're both having great regular seasons. 2 small market teams that are doing phenomenal, which I think everybody loves to see. Not so sure how long they're going to be around in the playoffs, and I just have a gut feeling that the Cubs are going to play really well down the stretch here. Not that I think the Brewers are going to collapse by any means, but it's only a 3-game lead. A 5-6 game stretch either way could really change that. So I actually think the Cubs are going to win the Central when it's all said and done. So that leaves us in the wild card. So let me get the easy one out of the way. The Brewers, of course, I think would be in the wild card. I don't see any way they miss the playoffs, so let's throw them in there. But that also leaves the Padres, the Diamondbacks, and the Phillies for the last 2 spots. Now, it would be very hard for me to pick against the Phillies in this case. I just think at the end of the day that teams got too much talent and they're too good to miss the playoffs. So let's give the Phillies a second wild card spot, and that really gets us down to the Padres and the Diamondbacks. So for me, I think right now, I think the Diamondbacks are the team that's going to get that 3rd wild card spot. I just like them a little more than the Padres. I think they're playing a little bit better. And I just think that they've got a chance to really kind of finish out the year really strong. So in the National League, Braves, Cubs, and Dodgers winning divisions. I think the Brewers and the Phillies and the Diamondbacks are the 3 teams that will come out of the wild card, which again, I would say would set up a really, really fun playoff. Really good teams, some really interesting matchups depending on where they end up fitting in and how they play out. And so I think there could be some really, really interesting series there in both leagues. So I'm super excited to watch these last 40 games. I'm even more excited to get to the playoffs again. I do think I've been struggling with the word to use. I think the proper word people want to use is parity. There's a lot of teams that are kind of equal. Might want to say some of these teams are you might consider average or mediocre. They're just a little better than other teams. But either way, it's baseball. When they get out on the field in the playoffs, it's going to be a blast, and I think there's going to be some pretty awesome series. So we'll have to wait here a few weeks, and certainly we will see how right or wrong I was. But that's where I think all these divisions shake out currently, and we'll be monitoring that here as we get down to the end of the season. So let's shift over to the CBA. So there's not been a lot of progress there, but I did want to recap some of the main points that are currently in the CBA. So both teams kind of came to the table initially with some pretty aggressive proposals, and everything we're hearing is they're so far apart, specifically on salary cap, that not even really willing to negotiate. So collective bargaining agreement runs out December 1st. I think a lot of people have been reporting that it looks like the owners definitely are more than willing to and are very prepared to lock the players out. I think December 1st, I don't want to say never, but I don't see there's no way anything gets done before December 1st. So, okay, we're going to have a lockout. Obviously, at that point, nothing's at risk. Games aren't at risk. Seasons aren't at risk. but there's no way they get something done by December 1st. It's going to take a lot more leverage than that, I think, in this case. So the stalemate really is salary cap versus luxury tax. Like, that's where the stalemate is. The owners obviously want salary cap. The players want luxury tax, right? And I get it. The players want everybody to make as much money as possible. The owners are trying to level the playing field a little bit. That's going to be the center of the argument. Quite frankly, there's going to be other items that are brought up. I think they're all meaningless. Everything else, I think there's a place in the middle that both sides can live with. It's going to come down to this. And I think what it's going to come down to is how long are the owners willing to lock the players out? And maybe more importantly, how long are the players willing to go without getting paid to finally come to an agreement? But at the end of the day, we could spend the next hour talking about all the other small things they're negotiating, but none of those things matter. It's going to come down to the salary cap versus luxury tax that, they're going to have to find an agreement on. So again, the owners, $245.3 million salary cap is what they proposed, and alongside a hard $171.2 million salary floor starting next season. Now, that word hard is put there specifically because it essentially means there will be no exceptions made for any team, meaning every team has to spend $171.2 million, period. Which, again, for a lot of teams in baseball, that's an increase, so I think that's good for the players. Certainly the hard cap there honestly doesn't affect most teams. There's a couple out there that I won't go on a soapbox about that it would have a huge impact on, primarily the Dodgers. But the parity that they're trying to create, at least from an owner's perspective, is where they're kind of bargaining that the hard cap makes a lot of sense, especially for the small market teams. And the owner's stance is hey, they're really getting squeezed under the current agreement. Now, interestingly enough, we just talked about who we think is going to win, and there's a lot of small market, what you would deem as small market teams, in that list of teams I think is going to be in the playoffs, which kind of goes against the argument that, there already is parity regardless of the salary cap, and I think the players certainly would make a strong argument there. And I'm not even saying factually they're wrong. Historically, baseball's been probably the one sport you can't buy a championship in, generally speaking. We saw for years and years and years this Yankees spent just completely unchecked, and they didn't win World Series. And so I do think it's just a sport that you can't buy it. But I think what's interesting is if the Dodgers win the World Series again, I think at that point the owners have a huge ground to stand on to say, yeah, everybody can be somewhat competitive, but they can't win. Dodgers get beat in the first round, you might have the players argue and see, like, they spent all that money and they got knocked out early. So how much does that really play into a negotiation? It probably doesn't that much. But from a fan's perspective, which is important, right? The court of public opinion is always important. That could be very interesting depending on how the Dodgers play. But nonetheless, that's really that. And basically the players, they just want to stick to the existing system, but they want to raise the lower tier luxury tax thresholds up to $300 million. Again, they just want things to stay the same and everybody keep getting paid some of these crazy numbers. A couple of things to keep an eye on: contract limits of 5 years for free agents. After that, they would ban deferred salary structures, which I think has to be done. We talked about that last episode. I think for me as a fan, that has to go away. I've mentioned before, minimum salaries would go up to $1 million, which is a big concession that the owners are giving to the players, which I think is a good one. And then certainly there's some stuff around drafting and how many rounds. And this one came up this week. I need to do some more research on this, but the non-negotiable hard bonus pool, at a very high level today, there's some negotiation that happens there. I think the owners are trying to make that very, very structured where there is no, negotiating and stuff. It's a hard number. Everyone sticks to it. I think, again, to try to keep things fair and equal. And so we're going to keep our eye on this. I unfortunately do not think there's an easy answer. I do not think this is going to end well. I think it's going to get real ugly, especially as we start getting closer to spring training and the idea of games might start being missed. But I also think that most people have almost come to the real, they just kind of have accepted the fact that there's probably going to be a lockout. We're probably missing games. And that never, ever is good for any sport and their fans, and that includes baseball. So my love of baseball, I'm begging the owners and players to come to an agreement. But the reality is that I think that's pretty far-fetched right now. And they finally will come to an agreement. I think the question is how much time and how many games are we going to lose? So we will keep our eye on that. All right, well, let's jump into Around the Diamond. Let's talk about who's hot. So I want to start with the polar bear, Pete Alonso. have a week. 579 average, 3 homers, 6 RBIs, on base is 652, slugged over 1,000. Pete Alonso's an interesting player. Back to my bias of the Atlanta Braves, I obviously had to hate him while he played for the Mets, but I've always been secretly a fan of Pete Alonso. I was glad to see him go to Baltimore. Obviously, they've had a really tough season, but always like to see the Polar Bear playing well, and he had a heck of a week. And then the Tampa Bay Rays, been the best team in baseball, 9-1 in their last 10. Mentioned earlier, kind of came out of the All-Star game a little flat, went through a little slump. They've gone right back to their winning ways, and certainly the last 10 days has not changed that, and they've been absolutely outstanding, been the best team in baseball over the last 10 days. And then on the cold front, Wyatt Langford for the Rangers is really struggling. Last week, a 105 average, 292 on base. He slugged 105. For those of you guys doing the math, that's an OPS of 397, which is quite frankly terrible. That team needs Wyatt Langford to be a superstar. They need him hitting, and they need him hot, and that's not been the case. So hopefully Langford can get that turned around here as we get into the last few weeks of the season. And then from a team perspective, 2 teams we talked about in the divisional races, and can they get in the playoffs? The Mariners and Guardians both really struggling, 2-8 in their last 10. The Mariners have been that way all year. The Guardians are just slowly playing their way out of contention, which probably didn't expect that, but that's where they are today. And so both those teams need some big changes here down the stretch if they're going to do anything that's going to impact the playoffs. All right, well, let's get to our turning back the clock moment this week. So before I get into the story, there's this thing that's kind of happened over the last 10 years where, people will say that, a pitcher threw a Maddox. And basically this is in reference to Greg Maddux pitching complete games and throwing 80 or 90 pitches, which is something he was kind of known for. One of my favorite pitchers, certainly in my lifetime that I got to watch. So I came across this story, and I really couldn't believe it at first. I kind of had to do some double checking here because I was like, man, even a Greg Maddux would be awfully impressed by this. So this goes back to August the 10th of 1944. So Charles Red Barrett of the Boston Braves threw the most efficient game in Major League Baseball history. The Boston Braves beat the Cincinnati Reds 2-0, but here's the crazy part. Red Barrett threw 58 pitches in the entire game. The game lasted an hour and 15 minutes. It's still the fastest night game ever recorded in Major League history. They played under the lights at Crosley Field. There were 7,700 fans in attendance. And this might be the most unbreakable record I've ever heard. So just a couple of interesting things from the game. He averaged 2 pitches per batter. He faced 29 total over 9 innings, and essentially he gave up 2 singles, one early in the game and one in the 9th inning. The recorded history says he never shook off his catcher, walked around the mound, and didn't waste any time between pitches. And this is where I think the story gets interesting. And you might argue this is the only way you ever get to an entire baseball game with 58 pitches. So not surprisingly, he didn't walk a single batter, which makes sense. He also didn't strike out a single batter. Every single play was every single at bat, the ball was in play. 13 ground outs, 7 pop outs, 5 fly outs, and 2 line drives to finish off the game. And interestingly enough, he was not an ace at that time. That season, he went 9-16 with a 4.07 ERA. And interestingly enough, Bucky Walters, who was one of the premier stars in the National League at the time, was who threw against him, who obviously also threw a very good game, giving up 2 runs. And so an hour and 15-minute baseball game, a complete game shutout of 58 pitches, which I think I feel very comfortable to say that record will stand through all of time unless something drastically changes in the game of baseball, because a 58-pitch shutout is something I couldn't have ever even imagined. And it's a pretty incredible feat. So, and I also feel like for the fans, if I paid my money to watch a game and the game lasted an hour and 15 minutes, I think I'd feel a little cheated there. But what a performance by Red Barrett on August 10th of 1944 to navigate through an entire game in 58 pitches. So, really interesting stat from this week and looking back in time over the history of baseball. All right, well, that's going to wrap up this episode. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, follow, comment, and you guys can find me on all social media, Winning Season SG. You can check out my website, winningseasonsg.com. Started doing some blogs on there. Obviously, we do content once a week on here. But as stories progress during the week, usually drop some blogs on there and kind of preview what's coming up in this week's episode. So check that out if you get a minute. And next week, I can't wait to see where we are. A lot can happen in a week in the major leagues, and it'll be interesting to see what stories might have changed week over week. So appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you all on the other side next time on the winning season with Seth G.